Picture this. You are a young Viking warrior named Bjorn, barely 18 summers old, sitting stiff-backed on a rough-hewn bench in the smoky half-light of the chieftain's longhouse. The air is oppressive, a suffocating cocktail of roasted meat, sour ale, damp wool, and the pungent musk of unwashed bodies pressed together in celebration. Smoke curls upward from the central hearth, stinging your eyes, its acrid weight mingling with the greasy laughter of men who have forgotten fear for one night. Their boasts, half truth, half legend, bounce off soot-blackened beams, weaving a thunderous tapestry of voices that threatens to crush all quieter thoughts. Tonight, the feast is not merely food and drink. It is ritual. Each horn of ale raised high is a performance of strength, each story a claim to immortality. Across the room, beards shine with the sheen of mutton fat, and fingers heavy with bronze arm rings clench and unclench as warriors replay the violence of the raid with words sharper than steel. They laugh with mouths stained red from blood and berries alike. They are alive, and they want the gods and the dead to know it. At the heart of this din, the skald rises, his voice cutting through the haze like a spear point. He chants of Odin's cunning, Thor's hammer, Freya's golden might stories, where gods are unbending, taking what they desire without apology. Around you, men listen, nodding, drunk on the comfort of certainty, that their gods are as unyielding as they must be. But you are not listening. Your gaze is caught elsewhere. Across the fire sits Leif, a warrior scarcely older than you, his hair still damp from melted snow, his face lined not by age, but by battle. You had stood shoulder to shoulder with him on the bloody shores of Northumbria, shield to shield as Saxon blades screamed against your own. His eyes, grey and cold as the northern sea, find yours across the flickering flame. No softness there, no smile. Yet within the space of a single heartbeat, a silent understanding passes between you. It is not brotherhood. It is not friendship. It is something sharper, stranger, infinitely more dangerous. The fire roars, but the warmth you feel is not from the flames. It is the perilous heat of recognition. You know the truth of this hall. Here, a man's worth is measured by the strength of his sword arm, the weight of silver on his wrist, and the number of sons he can sire. To be a man is to be a pillar of granite, unyielding, uncracked. Yet what happens when the stone fractures? What happens when the firelight reveals not just the warrior, but the man beneath? This is not the story sung by modern sagas or painted in films of horn-helmed berserkers and laughing shield maidens. This is the story hidden beneath the timber roof, pressed into the silence between glances. It is the untold truth of a world where honor was a razor's edge, and the wrong kind of desire could destroy you more thoroughly than any Saxon axe. For here, in this smoke-thick hall, your enemy is not the foreign monk with trembling hands clutching his cross. It is the gaze of your own kin, sharp as a blade, ready to cut you down with a word. One accusation, one whisper, and the heat you now feel could become the fire that burns your life to ash. So you hold Leif's eyes for a heartbeat longer than you should, long enough to know he feels it too. Then you lower them, joining the roar of your comrades, drinking deep, boasting louder than your fear. But inside, beneath the mask, you know, this is the most dangerous battle you will ever fight. Because in this world, the greatest insult is not to be called a coward. The greatest wound is to be called a woman. And the longhouse, filled with laughter and shadows, is already testing how well you can hide. The world knows the Viking as myth, a towering berserker, drenched in blood and glory. His desires simple gold, land, women. It is an image polished by centuries of sagas, and later by ink-stained monks who hated them and filmmakers who adored them. But the reality was more complex, more fragile, and infinitely more dangerous. For the young warrior in the longhouse, life is not a saga of endless victories. It is a performance. Every word, every gesture is measured. To laugh too softly, to step too lightly, to let your eyes linger where they should not all can spark suspicion. Masculinity is not just identity here. It is survival. Consider the shield wall, shoulder to shoulder, bodies pressed close, breath mingling in the storm of battle. These are bonds forged in blood. A warrior's life depends on the brother beside him. Love, then, is not just permitted, it is demanded. But there are boundaries. Affection must remain unsaid, devotion disguised as duty. Step beyond, and the brotherhood becomes a trap. That unspoken desire, the spark in Bjorn's glance toward Leif, carries a weight heavier than his iron sword. It is not passion, it is peril. The sagas rarely speak openly of such moments. They are written in silences, in the pauses between boasts, in the way grief is described when one warrior dies and another tears his clothes in mourning. Modern readers might see tenderness, Viking ears heard loyalty, yet beneath those words, another truth pulses. When a warrior wails for his fallen brother longer than for his wife, what are we meant to believe? The Vikings had a word for the unspoken danger, urgi. It did not mean love. It did not mean lust. It meant a fracture, a collapse of the masculine role. In this world, to be a man was to be unyielding, active, the one who strikes. To be passive, to receive, was to blur into the feminine, and that was unthinkable. To cross that invisible line was to risk not just ridicule, but annihilation. And so, in the smoky longhouse, as the fire crackles and laughter rises, Bjorn sits locked in silence. He and Leif are equals. Neither is weaker, neither is master. That is the danger. In the Viking mind, intimacy between unequals might be excused as domination, a crude assertion of power. But between equals, it is a gamble with no rules, where the cost of losing is not embarrassment, but erasure. The air in the hall grows thicker. The roar of the men around you no longer feels like laughter, but like a wall, closing in. Every boast of strength, every slap of a meaty hand on a table, every reminder of what it means to be a man is another weight pressing down. And across the fire, Leif's eyes remain steady, grey, and relentless. In that gaze is the question that must never be asked, the desire that must never be named, a desire more dangerous than any Saxon blade. There are weapons sharper than axes in this world. One of them is a word short, venomous, and deadly as steel. The Vikings called it nid. To utter it was not a jest, not a careless insult in a drunken hall. It was a curse, a spell that could unmake a man's life in the space of a heartbeat. At the heart of nid was ergi. No simple translation exists. It was not merely effeminacy, not simply desire between men. It was deeper, darker, the condition of being unmanly, passive, submissive. In the Viking world, ergi was not a private matter of desire. It was a public stain, a scarlet mark branding a man as less than human. To be accused of it was to be stripped of honor, rights, and kinship. Imagine it, a hall filled with warriors, the smoke still heavy in the rafters, when one man spits the word at another. In that instant, the accused has a choice: spill blood or accept annihilation. The law itself permitted it. If a man called you Arg, you could draw your blade and strike him dead where he stood, and no court would punish you. Words, in this world, carried the weight of law. Silence could mean the end of your reputation. Hesitation, the end of your life. Why so potent? Because urgi cut at the very roots of Norse society. Masculinity was not just pride, it was the pillar holding up law, kinship, inheritance, and faith. A man declared, "Arg," could no longer testify in court. His voice meant nothing. He could not inherit land. He could not swear oaths. He was a ghost, still walking, but stripped of substance. The sagas preserve echoes of these devastations. In the Laxdæla saga, a man named Raffan, stung by insults from his rival, Jartan, carved obscene figures, needstong, or spite poles depicting him in degrading sexual positions. These grotesque monuments stood like public executions in wood, visible to all, staining Jartan with shame. It was not childish graffiti. It was character assassination, backed by the gods themselves. The community, seeing these carvings, would laugh, sneer, whisper, and Kjartan's honor would bleed away with every rumor. This was the paradox Bjorn and Leif lived inside. The terror was not of desire itself, but of being placed in the wrong position. A man could wield dominance over another even sexually and still be seen as powerful, but to be the one beneath, the one who received, that was to become a shadow, a living corpse, a man whose own brothers would spit at him before casting him into exile. So when Bjorn locks eyes with Leif across the fire, it is not simply a look of longing, it is a dance with death. For if any rival saw that glance, twisted it, named it, shouted, "Ah!" into the smoky rafters, Bjorn's life would unravel in an instant. And unlike a duel on the battlefield, there would be no glory in this kind of death. Only silence, only shame, to be called *arg. Asterisk was not just an insult. It was a transformation, as swift and final as a sword through the chest. The moment the word settled on you, you ceased to exist in the eyes of your community. No law could protect you. No oath could bind you. No blood price could be paid for your life. You were no longer a man. You were something less. In Norse law, honor was not abstract. It was the currency of survival. A man's ability to inherit land, to marry, to testify at the king. The Saga. Assembly where disputes were settled, all rested on his reputation as honourable. To be accused of ergi stripped these rights away. The Arg man became a legal phantom, disqualified from the very fabric of society. His words were worthless, his oaths empty. He could not even stand in defence of his own bloodline. His children would inherit nothing but his shame. The sagas show us how devastating this could be. In one tale, a rival drives another to madness, not with blows, but with words, erecting grotesque carved poles, nidstong, mocking him in obscene sexual postures. Imagine walking past your own farmstead and seeing yourself immortalized in wood as a figure of ridicule, a warning to all that you were no longer a man, but a parody of one. Such insults could ignite feuds lasting generations. Yet there was a cruel irony in all this. The act itself was not always the true crime. What mattered most was which role you played. If you were the one who penetrated, you could still claim dominance, even against another man. But if you were seen as the one receiving, the passive, then the stain of ergi consumed you. The logic was brutal, but consistent. The active remained a man. The passive became less than one. This paradox meant that even acts of violence could be twisted into performances of power. Forcing another man into submission could be celebrated as an assertion of strength, even while consensual intimacy between equals was despised as weakness. The boundary between love and humiliation, between companionship and disgrace, was as thin as a blade's edge. Think of Bjorn, and Leif. Equals in strength, equals in honor. Between them, there is no hierarchy to shield them from suspicion. Their unspoken desire carries a far greater risk than the ale-fueled boasts echoing around them. One false step, one whispered rumor, and the law itself would grind down upon them with a weight heavier than any sword. Because for the Vikings, death was not the worst fate. Social death, being erased, mocked, dishonored, was the punishment that haunted the firelit silences of every longhouse. To die with a sword in hand was glorious. To live branded *arg* was unbearable. And Bjorn knows, even as the fire crackles, that one misplaced glance could cast him into that living grave. The paradox lay in the very structure of Viking life. These were men who spent months at sea, shoulder to shoulder in cramped longships where every movement was felt by 20 others. They wintered in makeshift camps where snow pressed against the walls, and the only warmth came from shared bodies. They trained together, bled together, guarded each other's backs with the blind trust of men who knew a single lapse could end them both. It was an existence designed to forge closeness. To survive, men had to love one another, though they could never call it love. The sagas describe the fierce loyalty of Felagar, battle companions bound tighter than brothers. They ate from the same pot, slept side by side under firs, entrusted one another with secrets too heavy for any other ear. But always there was the line. Step across it, and what had been strength became ruin. The taboo was not simple. Viking society did not necessarily despise the idea of one man dominating another. That, twisted though it was, could be reframed as proof of masculinity, a violent reinforcement of hierarchy. What it feared, what it outlawed, was equality in desire. Two men meeting as equals in passion. That was a threat no shield could guard against. For how could either claim dominance when the bond itself denied hierarchy? This is the tightrope Bjorn and Leif walk, though neither dares speak it aloud. Their shared glance in the longhouse carries all the weight of this contradiction. They are brothers in arms, forged by the same battles, cut from the same cloth. That equality, the very thing that makes their bond unbreakable in war, makes it lethal in love. The Norse lived in constant awareness of this tension. The longship itself was a crucible for unspoken intimacy. Imagine the endless weeks under sail, the slap of waves, the stink of tar and sweat, the rhythmic creak of oars. Nights when exhaustion forced men to collapse where they sat, pressed skin to skin under a wet cloak. In such closeness, emotions blurred. Brotherhood could feel like something more, but it was a fire that could never be fed. Every man in that hall knew the fear of suspicion. A smile held too long, a touch that lingered, a word spoken in too soft a tone could become fodder for ridicule. The sagas are filled with cruel taunts, barbed poems mocking rivals for supposed softness, accusing them of being ridden like mares or womanly in bed. These verses were not idle jokes, they were social daggers. The accused had to answer them with blood or live forever in their shadow. And so the Viking world, for all its brutality, was laced with silences. Affection existed, loyalty was celebrated, grief was given poetry, but desire had to be buried deep, hidden beneath layers of honor, masked by oaths of brotherhood. As the hall swells with laughter, Bjorn feels the paradox gnawing at him. His love for life is not weakness, not in his heart, but he knows the world will never see it that way. To act upon it would not be a moment of tenderness, but a gamble with his very existence. The fire roars, the mead flows, the boasts grow louder. Yet in the spaces between words, in the smoky silence of glances, lies the most dangerous truth of all. In this world, Love itself can be the sharpest blade. The longhouse falls briefly quiet as the skald shifts his tail. The hall still reeks of smoke and sweat, but now the words turning in the air are not about Thor's brute strength or Freya's fertile fields. They are about Odin, the All-Father. To the warriors around the fire, Odin is the highest ideal. God of war, God of kings, chooser of the slain. He is the patriarch they all pretend to mirror. But the skald's song holds a shadow most would rather ignore. Odin is no simple warrior. His power comes not only from the spear or the battlefield, but from cider, a form of sorcery that unsettled every man who heard of it. Cider was not the magic of clashing swords or storm-calling hammers. It was the quiet, insidious art of weaving fate, of foreseeing death, of bending minds. It was the magic of reception. A Vova, a woman prophetess, would sit high on a carved chair, chanting until her body became a vessel for spirits. She didn't act, she received. And here lay the paradox. Odin, god of masculine strength, learned this art from Freya, a goddess, and mastered it. The very magic that defined him as wise and cunning was the same magic that, if practiced by mortal men, branded them with ergi. To wield sader was to embrace the passive, to step into the feminine. A man who did so was despised, humiliated, exiled. But Odin did it openly. The sagas do not hide the tension. In the Lokasenna, the trickster god Loki unleashes his venom against the other gods. One by one, he names their secrets, their shames. When he turns his tongue on Odin, the insult is not about cowardice or greed, it is about sader. He spits that Odin once beat his drum and practiced sorcery like a witch, unmanly in mind. This was the most devastating accusation possible, to call even the All-Father Arg. And Odin's response. He does not deny it. He cannot. Instead, he deflects by pointing out Loki's own transgressions. In this divine exchange lies a staggering truth. Even the highest god, the model of kingship, lived with a shame that would have destroyed any mortal man. Odin hung 9 nights on the world tree to learn the runes. He sacrificed his eye for a sip of Mimir's well. He sacrificed even his masculine honor for the power of sader. What lesson does this leave for men like Bjorn? That the walls of masculinity are not absolute. That there are other kinds of power beyond brute force? Perhaps. But just as quickly, the opposite truth emerges. Odin can transgress because he is Odin. He is divine. He can absorb shame and twist it into strength. A mortal man cannot. For a man to follow Odin's path is not to become a god, but to become an outcast. The firelight flickers, shadows dancing along the walls like restless spirits. Bjorn feels the contradiction pressing on him. His world teaches him that to yield, to receive, is ruin. Yet the god they all hail as the father of war has done exactly that. The paradox does not liberate him. It suffocates him. It reminds him that the rules of this brutal society bend only for gods, never for men. In the smoke and silence of the hall, Bjorn senses the weight of an impossible truth. Even their gods are tainted by shame. If Odin embodies the paradox of shame and power, then Thor represents its opposite, the blunt certainty of strength. The men in the longhouse adore him. He is everything they wish to be. Massive, fearless, a god whose honor is his hammer, whose solution to every insult is violence. He never hesitates. He never doubts. Thor is masculinity in its purest, simplest form, unthinking, unyielding. And yet, even Thor is not safe from the bite of humiliation. The sagas tell of the day when his hammer, Mjolnir, was stolen. To retrieve it, he was forced into disguise, dressed as the goddess Freya, complete with veil and bridal gown, to trick the giants into returning it. The tale is told as comedy, but the laughter is edged with cruelty. Thor fumes with rage throughout, his humiliation only cleansed when the hammer is placed back in his hand and he slaughters his deceivers. Even the strongest god cannot escape shame when his gender is blurred. The story is funny only because it touches the rawest nerve of Norse society, that to be mistaken for a woman was to be less than a man. If Thor is the blunt edge of masculinity, Loki is the fracture line that runs beneath it. The trickster has no boundaries, no fixed form. He slips between shapes, between sexes, mocking the rigid structures that bind his kin. He births monsters, changes into mares, seduces and deceives. He even bears Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged steed, after transforming into a mare and mating with a stallion. This story is not comic. It is unsettling, even to the gods themselves. Loki embodies Ergi in its purest form. Instability, transgression, the violation of every norm. In Loki, the Norse saw chaos, the living reminder that their world of rigid hierarchies and honor codes was always at risk of collapse. And in the end, it is Loki who helps bring about Ragnarok, the doom of gods and men alike. His shapeshifting, his disregard for boundaries, is not simply mischief, it is cosmic danger. Around the fire, Bjorn listens to these tales with a heart heavy and divided. He sees Thor in the men around him, boastful, bellowing, terrified of any hint of softness. They roar their laughter as though to drown out doubt. But when his eyes fall on Leif, he sees something else: quiet calculation, a watchfulness, the kind of dangerous wisdom that belongs more to Odin than to Thor. And what of Loki? In Loki, Bjorn sees his own secret, reflected, distorted. The unspoken desire in his chest feels like a crack, a transgression that could unravel not just his honor, but his entire world. If Odin's path is forbidden, if Thor's path is suffocating, and Loki's path is destruction, where then is the place for someone like him? The gods offer no comfort. They are mirrors distorted, merciless, reminding him that even the divine live under the weight of shame. For men like Bjorn, there are no safe myths to cling to, only warnings. As the Skald's song fades, the longhouse erupts once more into laughter and argument. But for Bjorn, the echoes of the gods are louder than the living voices. He feels them pressing against his ribs, reminding him that the line between power and perversion, between honor and disgrace, is no wider than the edge of his sword. The Skald's voice fades, and the longhouse returns to its rhythm of boasting and brawling. Yet amid the noise, the chieftain raises his hand. Silence descends like a blade. Two farmers step forward, quarreling over a sheep, their dispute dragged into the heart of the hall. The judgment comes swiftly, a word from the chieftain, backed by the assent of his men. One man leaves vindicated, the other disgraced. No parchment, no signatures, no delay, only the living weight of law made flesh. This, Bjorn realizes, is what truly binds his world. Not gods, not gold, but law. And in that law lies a cage. The Icelandic Gragas, one of the great codes pieced together by later scribes, reveals the stark heart of this system. Honor was not optional. It was enforced, defended, codified. And at the core of it all was the terror of Nid and Ergi. The law did not merely recognize the insult, it sanctified it. If a man accused you of being Arg, you had the right to strike him down immediately, blade to flesh, without fear of punishment. To hesitate was to invite ruin. But what if the accusation stuck? What if there was proof or rumor strong enough to poison your name? Then came the worst fate of all: outlawry. To be declared an outlaw was not exile alone. It was erasure. Your property seized, your marriage dissolved, your children declared fatherless. You were no longer a man under law, but a vaga. A wolf. Hunted, shunned, fair game for any blade. To kill you was not murder, it was justice. The sagas describe outlaws wandering the wilds, half men, half ghosts, living in caves, stealing scraps from farmsteads until the inevitable end. An arrow in the back, a spear in the ribs. No one mourned them. Their deaths were a cleansing, restoring the order of society. This was the fate that shadowed every glance Bjorn cast at Leif. His desire was not simply dangerous, it was legally unspeakable. To love a man was to gamble with outlawry, to risk becoming a hunted animal. Even silence could not save you. A rival, a jealous kinsman, a drunken tongue. Any could plant the seed of suspicion. And once the word *arg* attached to your name, it clung like pitch. The longhouse fire snaps, sending sparks into the rafters. Bjorn watches them rise and vanish, thinking of how quickly a man's life could do the same. All it would take is one accusation, and he would be gone. Property seized, kin severed, memory cursed. The law was no shield for men like him. It was the blade pressed against his throat. In this hall, laughter and song fill the air, but beneath them lies the unspoken truth. Every man here lives in a cage of words sharper than swords, and for Bjorn, that cage is already closing. The laws of the North were written not only in ink, but in blood. An insult did not end with laughter, it demanded an answer. To be called arg was not a slight to be shrugged off. It was a challenge that could only be silenced by steel. And so, entire sagas unfold, not from land disputes or raids, but from words whispered in the wrong ear. One tale speaks of Bjorn, champion of the people of Hitterdal. His rival, Thora, poisoned his name with barbed verses, accusing him of softness, of taking the woman's place in bed. The taunt was not mere mockery. It was a social death sentence unless answered. For years, Bjorn pursued his rival, compelled not by hatred, but by necessity. His honor had been wounded deeper than flesh, and only blood could close the wound. Such sagas remind us, a Viking could not choose peace when shame was at stake. He could either kill or live forever unmade. This was the cruelty of their world. Violence was not just allowed, it was demanded. The cycle of feud and revenge fed itself endlessly, each man forced to prove again and again that he was not weak, not passive, not tainted. And there was another, darker truth. Even those who were victims bore the same mark of disgrace. In this culture, to be forced, to be raped, was no different than to consent. A man who suffered such violence was considered stained by urge, contaminated by passivity. Consent did not matter. The act itself was enough to destroy him. If he failed to seek vengeance, the shame grew heavier still. To live without blood revenge was to live as a broken man, stripped of honor. This left victims in an impossible bind: silence, and endure the whispers that would haunt them forever, or pursue a feud that might consume their life and the lives of their kin. Either path led to tragedy. There was no concept of victimhood, no sanctuary in law. Only the binary remained dominant or submissive, man or not man. The sagas give us glimpses of this merciless system. Men goaded into duels for slights as small as the pitch of their voice, mocked for walking too softly, condemned for grief expressed too openly. A single slip of tone or gesture could be twisted into proof of unmanliness. In such a world, life itself became a performance. Every stride, every laugh, every word was a shield against suspicion. And so, Bjorn sits in the hall, surrounded by laughter that feels like a trap. He knows that one lingering glance at Leif could be enough for an enemy to craft a verse, to whisper an insult, to carve a mocking pole. Once spoken, once sung, the accusation could not be recalled. It would demand blood, his or another's. In this way, violence was not merely the outcome of Viking life. It was its language. Honor was carved into flesh, shame erased in blood. And for Bjorn, every heartbeat beside the fire is a reminder that desire itself could be the spark that sets the saga of his destruction into motion. In the Viking world, manhood was not an essence. It was an act. Every man was an actor on a stage, performing strength for his peers, rehearsing dominance with every word and gesture. To falter, even for a moment, was to risk suspicion, ridicule, or worse. Consider the hall again. The raised voices, the deep laughter, the way men sit with shoulders squared and legs spread wide, claiming space like territory. None of this is casual. It is performance. To hunch, to speak softly, to let one's voice rise into a higher register, these could all be twisted into signs of weakness. Men sharpened their voices like blades, lowered them until they growled. They walked with heavy steps. They made their bodies into armor, their every movement a defense against slander. The sagas are filled with examples of this performance turning lethal. Rivals mocked each other in verse, comparing men to mares or women, suggesting they had been ridden. These poetic barbs, seemingly clever, carried deadly weight. A single stanza could ruin a man's reputation, forcing him to prove his honor in combat. Failure to respond with violence was proof of guilt. Thus, words became weapons, and masculinity became a battlefield that never ended. For Bjorn, this pressure was constant. His very body was a potential betrayer. The softness of his gaze, the hesitation in his hand, each might be seized upon by rivals eager to destroy him. He watched the men around him now with new eyes, how one deepens his laugh, how another slams his drinking horn louder than necessary, how each rehearses the part of strength. It is not joy, but vigilance. The hall is a theatre of masculinity. Every man, a player terrified of being unmasked. The legal codes made this performance inescapable. To be accused of ergi was not merely an insult, it was legal evidence. A whisper could disqualify you from speaking in court. Rumors could strip you of inheritance, silence your testimony, sever your kinship ties. Reputation was law. A man might survive wounds to his body, but a wound to his honor was fatal. This is the cage Bjorn feels tightening around him. His secret with Leif, invisible yet burning, is not only dangerous, it is unperformable. He cannot boast it away. He cannot laugh it into harmlessness. It exists in the silence between them, a silence that no performance can shield. Across the hall, the fire burns low. Men laugh, drink, slap one another on the shoulders, all of them actors in a brutal play. But Bjorn feels the truth. Beneath the bravado, each man fears the same thing, that the mask will slip, that someone will see, that a single word might shatter the role they have spent their lives performing. Masculinity, in this world, is not freedom. It is a costume. And for those like Bjorn, the costume is a prison from which there is no escape. The longhouse quiets for the night, but Bjorn's mind drifts outward, beyond the fjords, beyond the snow, to the foreign lands he has seen from the prow of a longship. He remembers monasteries, stone walls rising above lonely coasts, bells tolling over quiet fields. They were strange places, filled with men unlike any he had known. Monks, they called themselves. Men who wore simple robes, who carried no blades, who had sworn to live without wives or children, bound to silence and prayer. To Vikings, such men were a mystery and an affront. What kind of man rejected gold, battle, and heirs? What kind of man chose passivity, obedience, and chastity? To Bjorn's world, they were the very image of ergi. They turned their backs on the spear, the plough, and the bed. They neither struck, nor sowed, nor sired. To Norse eyes, they seemed unmanly, less than men. And so, when the longships descended upon Lindisfarne in 793, the slaughter was not just greed for treasure, it was contempt. The English chronicler Alcuin wrote of the horror, how holy men were struck down before their altars, their sanctuaries despoiled. To him, the Vikings were demons from the sea. But from the Viking perspective, it was a performance of dominance. The monks, with their quiet chants and delicate hands, were proof of weakness. To seize their gold and their lives was to assert Norse strength over their softness. The brutality may have gone further than plunder. Some scholars whisper of darker humiliations, that sexual violence against captured monks was not unknown, framed not as desire, but as ultimate domination. To force such men into submission was to brand them permanently with ergi, to mock their vows of purity and stamp them with shame. For the Norse, it was a weapon of psychological warfare, a way of rewriting conquest into the bodies of the conquered. This clash of worlds bred hatred that echoed for centuries. To the Christians, the Norse were godless savages, wolves sent by Satan. To the Norse, the Christians were laughable weaklings, fit only for chains. Each side despised the other for failing to live by its own vision of manhood. Bjorn thinks of this as he lies awake on the bench. He has seen monks, with their lowered eyes and soft hands. He has seen them die like lambs, silent and bewildered. And yet, something in their quiet unsettled him. They had no need to boast, no need to perform. Their strength, if it could be called that, lay in surrender, in devotion to an unseen god. To a Viking, that was folly. To Bjorn, it was incomprehensible. But lying here now, with the warmth of life across the fire, he wonders, was it weakness? Or was it another kind of courage? To reject violence, to live by silence and prayer. Perhaps it was its own defiance. Perhaps the monks lived by rules as unyielding as his own, only written in a different tongue. The clash of civilizations was not just swords against crosses. It was one definition of manhood colliding with another, each convinced the other was unworthy. And in the space between them, men like Bjorn felt the tremors of doubt. The sea did not confine the Norse. Their longships slipped through river mouths and threaded deep into the veins of Europe, carrying them east into the Slavic forests and south into the glittering shadow of Constantinople. Wherever they went, their measure of manhood followed them, sharp as an axe edge. Among the Slavs, they found warriors who fought with spears and bows, chieftains who bargained as much as they battled. Trade routes sprawled through their landsfurs, honey, amber, and slaves flowing westward, silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate flowing eastward. Here, Viking steel was feared, but so too was their arrogance. For the Norse judged even allies through the lens of dominance. A leader's worth was measured not in wisdom or words, but in how many men he commanded, how many wounds he bore, how loudly his name carried in the hall. Further south lay Constantinople, the queen of cities, a place so vast and dazzling it seemed a dream. Its walls rose higher than any hall, its domes glittered like the sun, and its streets thronged with languages from every corner of the known world. Here, the Vikings known as Varangians became mercenaries in the service of the Byzantine emperors. They stood as bodyguards, axes gleaming in the torchlight of palaces filled with silk and gold. For their loyalty, they were given riches and honor. And yet, even here, they judged by the old code. Byzantine courtiers whispered with painted lips, wore robes perfumed and delicate. To Norse eyes, they seemed effeminate, clever, but soft. Diplomacy intrigue, learning. These were not the virtues of warriors. They were suspicious, even contemptible. The Varangians respected wealth, but they respected most the chance to prove strength with steel. This pattern repeated wherever they went. In Ireland, in Francia, in the Ruslands, the Norse lens remained fixed. A man's value lay in aggression, in action, in dominance. A monk bent in prayer, a courtier weaving words, a merchant fat with coin but unbloodied all seemed suspect. In their eyes, these men were vulnerable, weak, deserving of conquest. But there was danger in this worldview. It blinded them to other kinds of power. Where they saw softness, others built empires. Where they mocked subtlety, others wove systems of law and faith that outlasted them. Slowly, without their noticing, the tide was turning. The Christians and Byzantines, who seemed so unmanly, were crafting structures of power that would eventually swallow the Norse world whole. Bjorn does not know this yet, of course. He only knows the code he has been given. To dominate is to live. To yield is to die. He has seen Slavs parley, Greeks scheme, monks pray. Each time, he has felt contempt, and yet a flicker of doubt. Could there be strength in other forms? Or was his people's path the only true one? The fire in the longhouse burns lower, and he imagines again the domes of Constantinople, the chants of monks, the whispers of Byzantine courtiers. Other worlds, other rules. But here, within these walls of timber and smoke, only one law holds. A man must never yield. The old gods still held sway in Bjorn's world, their names whispered in prayers before battle, their stories sung by the skald in smoky halls. But far to the south, another faith was rising, creeping northward like frost across a field. At first, it came in whispers, traders crossing the sea, missionaries speaking of a single god nailed to a cross, kings who bent knee not to Odin or Thor, but to Christ. Then, more and more, it came in law. Christianity did not replace the Viking code overnight. It layered itself upon it, twisting it, reshaping it, until men found themselves caught between two cages. Where the Norse feared ergi, the Christians feared sodomy. And unlike the old system, where only the passive partner was disgraced, the new faith condemned both. It no longer mattered who struck and who yielded. If two men lay together, both were damned. This was a profound shift. The old laws punished shame in this life outlawry, erasure, the wolf's fate. The new laws reached into the afterlife. Sodomy was not just dishonor, but mortal sin, an act that could drag both men's souls into eternal fire. The fear was no longer only social, it was cosmic. The judgment was no longer from kin and neighbors, but from an all-seeing God who peered into the private recesses of the heart. For men like Bjorn, this was a terrifying transformation. The old code, brutal though it was, at least had its logic. A man could navigate it, play the role, fight to defend his honor. But the Christian code was absolute. There was no loophole for the dominant partner, no jewel that could wipe away the stain. The act itself was the crime. Desire itself was evidence enough. The sagas and laws of the later centuries reflect this uneasy fusion. In Iceland and Norway, as Christianity took root in the 11th century, old prohibitions against ergi remained, but they were reframed through the church's lens. What had once been a matter of honor became a matter of sin. The punishment was no longer only outlawry, but penance, scourging, even execution, and beyond that, the invisible punishment of hellfire. Imagine the suffocation of this shift. A man like Bjorn, already forced to perform masculinity like armor, now had to fear not only the gaze of his peers, but the gaze of heaven. His silence, his restraint, his caution could no longer guarantee safety. Even his thoughts condemned him. The priests who preached this new order spoke of purity, of marriage sanctified by God, of eternal reward for those who denied fleshly desire. To men like Bjorn, their words must have seemed as alien as their Latin chants. And yet, their power grew. Kings converted, chieftains followed, and the old gods began to fall silent. This was not freedom. It was a new prison built upon the bones of the old. For the Viking fear of ergi was not erased by Christianity. It was absorbed, sanctified, and given eternal weight. Now, to risk desire was not only to face outlawry in this life. It was to gamble with damnation in the next. Before the cross spread north, the fiercest love a Viking could know was the love of his feilagi, his battle companion, his shield brother. The sagas brim with these loyalties, men swearing oaths to die together, avenging each other's blood with relentless fury, mourning with a grief so raw it outshone any description of marital love. These bonds were not mocked, they were revered. To stand closer to your comrade than to your kin was seen as proof of honour, not its betrayal. But the Christian priests who came with their Latin prayers and carved crucifixes looked upon these bonds with suspicion. To them, passion between men, whether in battle or in grief, smelled of danger. The old brotherhood, so essential to the Viking way of war, could too easily be twisted into sodomy. Where the Norse had seen devotion, the Church saw temptation. Where sagas celebrated fierce male love, sermons warned of hidden sin. The effect was slow but corrosive. The songs of loyalty and vengeance began to sour. Priests urged men to love chastely, as monks loved one another in cloisters, or to direct their passion into the sanctified bond of marriage. Anything else, anything too intense, too intimate, risked suspicion. Imagine what this meant for men like Bjorn and Leif. In the old world, they could have sworn oaths of brotherhood, cloaked their closeness in honour, hidden behind the poetry of loyalty. Their bond, though dangerous, had a name the culture understood. But under the gaze of Christianity, even that mask grew thin. Their loyalty could now be reframed as sin, their grief as evidence of forbidden desire. This shift also transformed the very rhythm of society. Where once the longhouse and the shield wall defined manhood, now the church and the priest began to intrude. A warrior's honour was no longer measured only by what his peers thought, but by whether he lived in accordance with Scripture. Masculinity was pulled in two directions, still expected to dominate, still demanded to perform strength, but now shackled by a moral code that despised desire itself. For Bjorn, this created a new kind of fear. His silence, once enough to protect him, could now betray him in the eyes of God. His loyalty to Leif, once coverable by the oaths of brotherhood, could now mark him as a sinner. The very bond that once promised survival had become suspect. The fire in the longhouse is dying, embers glowing red against the dark. Bjorn looks across at Leif, and for a moment he imagines a future not of exile or outlawry, but of sermons and priests, of whispered confessions and eternal damnation. The gods of old had punished men like him with shame and erasure. The new God promised punishment without end. And in that vision, Bjorn sees a truth more chilling than the cold wind outside. The world is closing in, and soon there will be no refuge left for men like him at all. Not every secret was doomed. In the cracks of Viking lore, in the spaces between sagas and sermons, there existed rituals and customs that may have offered men like Bjorn and Leif a shield thin, fragile, but real. Chief among them was the oath of fosbredralag, foster brotherhood, or blood brotherhood. Two men could swear this bond before their kin and gods, mingling their blood by cutting their palms and pressing them together beneath an arch of turf. Symbolically, they entered the earth and were reborn, not as friends, but as kin. The oath bound them to defend one another, to share their wealth, to avenge each other's deaths as if they were true brothers. In the sagas, these sworn brotherhoods are celebrated as the pinnacle of loyalty, their devotion described in terms that burn with passion and intensity. For men like Bjorn and Leif, such a ritual might have been salvation. Within the sacred shelter of foster brotherhood, closeness was not only tolerated, but honored. They could sleep side by side, share secrets, stand closer than any other men, and no one could question it. What in another context might raise suspicion could here be explained, even celebrated, as loyalty. Their love could be hidden in plain sight, translated into a language their culture recognized. Even poetry, the very weapon used to destroy reputations, could serve as cover. Norse culture thrived on kennings layered, metaphorical phrases that spoke in riddles. If an enemy could craft a verse to ruin a man, perhaps two men could weave their own subtle language to cloak affection. A shared glance across the fire, a whispered line of verse, a reference to Odin's contradictions. These could become their secret tongue, invisible to all but them. And there were other spaces where the cage loosened. Merchants travelling far from home, Varangians serving in Constantinople, men who wandered beyond the constant surveillance of kin and neighbours. These had more freedom. In distant lands, where no one knew their lineage or cared for their honour, perhaps bonds could form without the constant threat of slander. Perhaps in the shadow of foreign walls, Bjorn and Leif could breathe more freely than in the smoky prison of the Longhouse. Even the sagas, strict as they are, sometimes betray traces of this hidden world. They speak of men whose grief for their companions is so deep, so raw, that it sounds more like the mourning of a lover than a brother. They describe bonds so intense that marriage seems secondary. The words are framed as loyalty, but between the lines there is something else, a silence heavy with possibility. So Bjorn considers the path before him. He cannot name what he feels for Leif. He cannot act upon it without risking outlawry, shame, or eternal damnation. But perhaps he can disguise it. Perhaps they can swear an oath, bind themselves in blood, and cloak their desire in the armor of loyalty. They would live on a knife's edge, their love hidden in the guise of brotherhood, their intimacy buried beneath the roar of battle and the silence of the shield wall. It is not freedom, it is survival. But in a world as merciless as his, survival itself is a victory. Dawn bleeds into the longhouse through the smoke hole above, painting the rafters in grey light. Around Bjorn, his comrades sleep where they fell, their snores rising and falling like the sea. The fire is little more than glowing embers now, pulsing faintly, as though even it is too weary to continue. In this hush, when the noise of laughter and boasting has died away, the world feels fragile, suspended. It is in these moments, not in the roar of feasts, that secrets breathe. Bjorn looks at Leif. His companion stirs, eyelids heavy, hair tangled from sleep. Their eyes meet again, stripped of the fire's flicker, stripped of the mask of performance. In this pale light, there is no laughter to disguise their closeness, no scaled to drown it in verse. For a heartbeat, the truth of their bond hangs unguarded between them. History does not tell us what happened to men like Bjorn and Leif. The sagas, written by those who celebrated chieftains and killers, rarely record the quiet defiance of hidden lives. The law codes scream their prohibitions. The poets carve their slanders into memory. But the silences, the glances, the whispered words, the bonds disguised as loyalty, these are lost in the spaces between ink and parchment. And yet, The very violence of those prohibitions proves that such men existed. Societies do not build such elaborate cages unless they fear what lies inside. The endless verses mocking rivals as passive, the intricate laws condemning ergi, the sermons railing against sodomy, all of these testify to a reality that could not be erased, that desire lived, even in the darkest of halls. Some found ways to endure. The ritual of foster brotherhood may have sheltered them. The coded language of poetry may have hidden them. Foreign service in Constantinople or distant trade may have given them room to breathe. Their love, unspeakable, may have survived by masquerading as loyalty, their passion disguised as grief, their tenderness hidden in the rough embrace of comradeship. What they could never do was name it. There would be no liberation, no flags, no pride. Only survival in silence. Acts of quiet courage lived on the knife's edge of annihilation. Their stories remain unwritten, woven not into sagas, but into glances across the fire, into blood mingled under turf, into the unrecorded moments when two men found each other in a world sworn to deny them. The embers collapse, sparks fading into ash. Outside, the fjord lies still, iron grey beneath the rising sun. Inside, the men stir to life again, donning their masks, rehearsing their roles. Bjorn does the same. But inside, he carries the ember of a different truth, a truth unspoken, dangerous, yet alive. This, then, is the story the sagas do not tell, not of conquest or kingship, but of survival. Not of men who bent the world to their will, but of men who bent themselves, silently, desperately, to survive a world designed to crush them. History remembers warriors, gods, and laws, but somewhere, in the shadows of the longhouse, in the whispers never written down, lived men like Bjorn and Leifman, whose love endured in silence. And that silence is its own kind of saga.